one of the hallmarks of the IIJA was the implementation of a tremendous number of discretionary grant programs, basically competitive programs that require an application and then a decision made by USDOT or some of the other agencies that are represented in the IIJA about who gets the funding. So I went through quickly to take a look of the 18 programs where MPOs are eligible recipients. There are currently 4 programs under which MPOs have directly received a grant, and that includes reconnecting communities where there was one MPO that received a grant through the Federal Railroad Administration. There's 8 programs in which MPOs, although eligible, did not receive a grant. 6 programs that there has been no grants awarded. A couple where there isn't even any information yet about implementation, and some others that there's no FOs. The funding announcement is out, but they haven't made any final decisions. So, and I'm not going to pretend like this tells the entire story, because there's plenty of projects, as Dave mentioned, where there's support from the MPO for a local project, and so the local recipient may have gotten something. But I think it does illustrate a little bit of some of the challenge that that always comes with discretionary grant programs. We're big proponents of formula funding, where money goes out and everybody across the nation gets some funding, and for whatever particular program we're talking about. And I know that there's definitely some worthy programs that are that are receiving discretionary funding, and we'll talk a little bit about what we might do with some of those. But ultimately, it's really formula funding where we like to see the focus of these funds go. But that gives you a little bit of a rundown from the MPO perspective, at least, on how some of the funding is going under IIJA. So there's a number of concerns that have been raised from that I hear quite a bit from members, and I don't want to come away from this sounding too negative, because I think there's lots of opportunities, continuing with IIJA, and then as we look forward, certainly. One is that even though there's a lot of eligibility for local entities and for MPOs, that perhaps we still continue to focus on sending money to state DOTs, and perhaps a little bit too little to MPOs. Cities have done reasonably well under some of the programs in IIJA. I think there's an argument that counties have not fared quite as well. And that's an area of interest and concern. That grant applications are fairly expensive and cumbersome in order to put together, which actually has its own equity component. One of the things that the IIJA is seeking to do is make sure that communities of all sizes and types are able to access some of these funds. But at the end of the day, when you have an expensive application process, communities that are less resourced are going to have a harder time succeeding under that kind of a process. And while we're seeing grant awards coming fairly consistently, I think DOT has done a pretty admirable job reviewing, first of all, standing these programs up. Many of these were brand new programs, dozens of them. They've done a good job standing those up and getting the funding opportunities out, and even making awards. The place where we're really seeing a slowdown is in actually getting grant agreements on the ground. So they're announcing which projects are getting funding, but then it's taking a year, sometimes even 18 months, in order to get grant agreements in place that will actually allow the funding to hit the ground. A little bit of a lack of consistency in NOFO timing. They're sometimes putting out 2, even in some cases 3 years worth of funding in one funding opportunity. And that's been a concern. And then some local recipients that are receiving federal dollars, the IIJA creates a structure where local communities have a much greater chance of accessing funding directly. But some of them are not understanding that by receiving that funding, they're actually entering into a relationship with the Federal Highway Administration or USDOT, which is a new thing to navigate. Federal funding is not particularly straightforward. It's a challenging world to navigate, and that's something that we've heard about as well. And then, of course, local match always something that folks have a challenge with in many places. But like I said, there's plenty of positives. Obviously, there's lots of funding. We're opening up new opportunities for cities, for counties to access federal funding directly to meet their own priorities. And it cuts across a broad array of programs. We're seeing focus in some areas that I think there's a lot of interest in, and a recognized need for some action. And the IIJA worked hard to meet the need in some of those areas that perhaps we had not been focusing on code as much. And I think the opportunities going forward might include turning some of those discretionary grants into formula programs, and then making some changes to some of the programs to make them, especially the ones that are sort of inherently regional or local, to make them function a little bit more regionally and locally. So as I mentioned, the tide in DC is starting to turn already from a focus on implementation to one on reauthorization. We're about to hit the half-life of IIJA occurs in May 2024. That's the 2.5-year mark on this 5-year bill. And I think we're facing a more interesting reauthorization than we usually do. First off, the size of the bill, $1.2 trillion, makes it a different beast than we typically face when we're just talking about transportation reauthorization. The breadth of this program extends well beyond just transportation into some other areas. It's a question of how many of those other areas are we going to continue to support in the future legislation, and so there's some big questions surrounding which pieces of the IIJA are going to be preserved and which might be foregone. So there's some big picture issues I'm going to talk a little bit about. I'm going to stay away from the political because, frankly, I don't predict the future. I would love to, but I don't. So obviously, it's going to be different if it's a second term of President Biden or a second term of President Trump. And it's certainly going to be different depending on which party is running each chamber. And in fact, as we look ahead, we're probably going to see two changes. We're going to see two elections before we actually get to reauthorization. So we'll have this next upcoming election in November, and then it'll most likely be the election after that actually determines who's going to be in charge when we're really getting into the conversation about reauthorization. So that's so far in the future that we simply don't know where we're going to be at that point. So some of the funding issues that we're talking about, this bill, as I mentioned, has an enormous baseline. I think there's a lot of interest in preserving as much of that baseline as possible for transportation, sure, but also for some of the other programs that are also part of the IIJA. There was also a very interesting approach taken by Congress in funding this bill. They used something that we've never seen used at this magnitude before called guaranteed appropriations. Basically what that was is it was a check written to these programs at the outset. As soon as the bill passed, that funding was essentially available for spending, unlike what we typically see with programs like this, including the transportation program, where they authorize in advance funding, but that still requires additional activity later by Congress to say, okay, here the money is now let. In this case, the funding was made available immediately upon the bill passing. There's a lot of people that really like that process. They really like not having to worry about obligation authority and some of the other strictures that come with the program, as you know, with some of the programs that we've had in the past. So it's going to be interesting to see if Congress decides to continue to use that guaranteed appropriation process. And of course, there's the Highway Trust Fund. I'll talk a little bit about in just a minute. Our endlessly going broke savings account where all the funding or all the funds from our our fuel taxes end up, that ostensibly is there to pay for the transportation program, has fallen woefully short, continues to fall woefully short of actually funding the full transportation program, something that continues to get kicked, the can on that continues to get kicked down the road. We'll see what they decide to do there. And if we'll start a serious conversation about what's next, which could include mileage-based user fees, where folks pay by the mile instead of paying by the gallon of fuel that they purchase. And then some of the structural issues I'll get into a little bit more on some of the unspent balances, this idea of discretionary versus formula, and then the direct access of local governments to some of this funding. But first, I do want to touch on the Highway Trust Fund. You can see the red line is sort of a continuation of the spending that is going on in the IIJA into the future, and the blue lines represent the declining level of income coming into the Highway Trust Fund from fuel taxes, of course, starting to decline precipitously in part because of the change to electric vehicles, which pay no fuel tax. And you can see the yawning gap between the red line and the blue lines, which shows the deficit that we face each year in transportation. So as we look ahead, you can see that for the next 5-year reauthorization cycle, we're projected to be approximately $187 billion short in the Highway Trust Fund, which would require either a massive increase in the fuel taxes. I don't even know if we could increase it enough to really capture that in any realistic way, or more likely continue to do what we've been doing the last dozen or so years in transferring enormous amounts of money from the general fund into the highway trust fund to cover that gap. All right, so quickly through some of the big picture issues, that idea of preserving the baseline, preserving those guaranteed appropriations. A big issue that I think we face at the local level, but also at the state level, are some of the unspent balances. There was a huge influx of funding. Folks expected to very quickly gear up and be ready to spend a lot of money that frankly had never really flowed in their direction before, at least not in these quantities. And I think there's a concern that if those funds don't get spent down, Congress is going to look at that and say, well, why would we give you more money if you're not able to spend the money that we're giving you? So hoping that we can create perhaps some better support for, especially for communities that haven't received direct funding before, for MPOs perhaps, but even for states to get that money out the door as quickly as possible. As I mentioned, the opportunity of taking a look at programs, discretionary programs of some type, are really thought of as a way to get some funding out the door for a particular purpose. And in many cases, our feeling is that if it's important enough, transportation safety would be a great example. What we should do is we should formalize programs that are of particular value nationwide to make sure that funding is getting out to everybody for those programs, especially the ones that we've established are working well, including the Safe Streets and Roads for All is, I think, a great example of that, where funding is going directly to locals to meet important transportation safety needs. And we need to continue to bolster that, but I think expand that so that everybody is getting a piece of that pie, not just those that are able to get through the discretionary grant process. And then, as I mentioned, the opportunity for local governments to have a little bit more direct access to some of these funding. I think it expands greatly the base of eligible entities, and therefore the folks that are engaging with the process. I don't think that that's a bad thing at all. I think that's a great thing. I think it expands the support for the program to have cities and counties that are directly benefiting from the program. As I mentioned, the award decisions are moving, but the grant agreements are really not. And I think there's an interest in retaining this direct funding among the cities and counties, of course, and the associations that represent them in Washington. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And I think the real opportunities that lie before us are outlined here. First, a lot of the focus is going to be on discretionary grant programs, because that was sort of the big new thing that happened on IIJA. But I don't want us to lose focus on some of the important areas that are still vital aspects of the transportation program. First and foremost, from an MPO perspective, is the transportation planning funding that goes directly to keeping the lights on and the doors open at each MPO across the nation. We also want to improve MPO access to the programs that are retained in IIJA that are carried over from IIJA to the next reauthorization, expand the amount of formula funding, and then expand this sort of walled off programs. I put that in quotes, but one of the nice things about the Safe Streets and Roads, Safe Streets program is that it's only MPOs and locals that are eligible for that. And so finding ways to look at those types of programs that are inherently local, inherently regional in scope, including some safety programs, access programs, carbon reduction, innovation in smart cities, and then the nexus between housing and transportation. How do we better support all of those initiatives at the local level? Can we find some other opportunities where funding is explicitly rolling to locals and MPOs for those purposes? And then figuring out ways to expand MPO opportunities within the bill. And then really importantly, and I'll close with this, is one of the things we're going to need to do in order to show Congress that we need to support a robust program going forward. We need to preserve those baselines. We need to do all the things that we hope that they do in supporting a large piece of legislation going forward, is really accentuating the wins that came out of IIJA and that will continue to come out of this program. And that's where we can use all of your help in making sure that the grants that you're receiving or the formula funding that you're receiving, that you're letting the world know the great work that you're doing with that. You're letting members of Congress know the great work that you're doing with that. and you're really pounding on the idea that with these additional funds, great things are happening at the local level and at the regional level, because they need to hear that message. It's a really important part of bolstering Congress and encouraging them to support this legislation going forward. So with that, I will say thank you, and I will continue to hit the wrong button. Thank you very much for having me here today. And if I have any time, I'm happy to answer